Good morning, Patrick. Thank you for joining Storyburg, the Convos, talk about Pittsburgh.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right. You are the CEO of the Greater Pittsburgh Art Council.
That's correct. I've served as the CEO of the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council since June 2023.
So what does the organization do?
Yeah, so we are what's referred to as a local arts agency, and most mid-size or larger cities across the U.S. will have some form of local arts agency. It might be called an arts agency, it might be called an arts council, it could be called the cultural council, but the work of that organization is really defined by the context of the arts ecosystem in which it operates. In some cities, it might be a direct extension of municipal government, and in other cities, it's a standalone 501c3. And in some cities, it might be some type of hybrid between those two things. Here in Pittsburgh, we are a standalone 501c3. This year, we celebrate our 20 years. Again, recognizing that the role of the organization is defined by the context of the ecosystem in which it serves. We have the opportunity here in Pittsburgh to be very narrow but deep in our work. That's because there are so many tremendous presenting and producing groups in Pittsburgh, as well as arts intermediaries that exist in Pittsburgh. So for us, our four roles is one, we're an information hub for the sector. So if you are an arts practitioner or someone working within the field, you should be able to go to the Arts Council and find the information that you need, whether that be about resources and opportunities, policy issues, events happening within the sector, whatever the information is, we should be able to provide it to you. The second is that we are an amplifier for our sector. So it's our responsibility to help uplift the stories of our sector so that they're reaching broad audiences. So really telling the story of the individuals and organizations that are working within our field. The third is that we are a convener of our sector. So the arts are a very expansive field, and art itself is a spectrum. And sometimes it can be siloed based off of budget size, career level, geographic location, medium and discipline. And as an organization, we really work to dismantle those silos and bring the sector together to have a relationship with itself so that we can be a harmony of voices and go out into the community as a chorus of those voices and really make sure that we are telling our story effectively. And with that, our fourth role is that we're an advocate. We serve as the leading advocacy voice within our sector. So really trying to uplift the priorities that come to us from that convening to make sure that we're going forth to both elected officials and funders and other stakeholders with the voices and aspirations of our sector in mind.
So who are the funders of GPAC? Basically, who pays you?
Yeah, so our organization historically has been very grant dependent, and that's something that we are actively working to address because we know that sustainability requires diversity in revenue. And historically, we have been very much funded by the major foundations in this community that have a long history to funding the arts. So organizations like the Heinz Endowment and Hillman and others that, again, have a history of funding a lot of the presenting and producing groups in the community, also have a history of funding the Arts Council. We also do receive county funding through RAD, the Allegheny Regional Asset District. And then we also receive some state funding through the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts. The Pennsylvania Council on the Arts has what they call district partners that help administer programs on their behalf, and we are a re-granting partner here in southwestern Pennsylvania. So for that service of re-granting, we also do receive some administrative fees from the state. Beyond that, we're launching in September a membership program that will help bring forth some earned revenue by way of dues that we receive from our members, which tends to be individuals working within our field, whether as workers of cultural organizations or arts practitioners themselves, and then arts organizations. We have at this point very little that's contributed to us through corporate revenue. We don't have a lot that has historically been a strong case for support for sponsorship because we're not a producing or presenting organization. So we can't provide that brand exposure that maybe somebody like the Symphony or the Playhouse might be able to do. And then in addition to that, we don't have a strong history of individual contributions by way of donations. It's challenging being an intermediary because you're working very diligently to serve organizations and make sure they have access to resources.
Yeah.
And there can sometimes be a perceived conflict of interest if you're going out into the community and trying to raise revenue for your work through individual donors, because there can be a perception that if those folks are passionate about the arts, why should they give to an intermediary if they can give directly to the organizations that are producing and presenting work?
All right. So you've been here for 2 years?
Yes.
Wow. You got everything nailed down.
I'll also say this is the third arts council that I've worked for and the second that I've led. So the better portion of the last 10 years have been working within this specific organization type in other markets as well. So I have a degree of familiarity from that.
All right, we will circle back to the GPAC. Now let's talk about you. So you mentioned that this is your third position. So where are you from? Before Pittsburgh, where were you? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very small rural community about halfway between Pittsburgh and Erie here in Western Pennsylvania.
Okay.
It's a small community called Cochranton, which is in Crawford County. Very homogeneous, one stoplight, about 1,200 people. And for me, I grew up in that community feeling very much like a black sheep. It is a very conservative community. Again, coming from a kind of homogeneous demographic makeup, there's also a lot of challenges and issues with xenophobia, homophobia, racism, and other things that can be present because there's a lack of diversity to expand perspectives and mindset. So for me, as soon as I turned 18 and graduated high school, I left. And I've bebopped around quite a bit as an adult. I've spent 2 stints in Florida, one in South Florida, one in North Florida. I lived in Alaska.
Wow.
I lived up in Erie, Pennsylvania. I spent a year traveling around North America in a camper with my dog. So I've definitely had a non-traditional life. What really, I think, helped shape my world outlook and my perspectives and values, especially growing up in a somewhat white conservative bubble. When I was 15, I stumbled into punk rock and hardcore and started going to shows both in Erie and down here in Pittsburgh. And a lot of the bands, and this is the early 2000s, so this is the Bush administration, this is the war in Iraq, this is, Walmart's changing local economies and seeing the death of kind of mom and pop businesses. This is the rise of kind of fast fashion. So what I saw in the early 2000s when going to these shows was a lot of the bands used their time on stage as a platform to speak against issues. And it really helped me realize that the arts can also be a social platform and that art can be a social practice. And so it really shaped a lot of my kind of global perspectives. And also I think instilled kind of this DIY ethos and always a problem, always a solution, right? And so that really helped, I think, prevent me from going down some of the same pathways that my peers in my community kind of ventured down, right? When you're in a economically depressed, kind of isolated rural community, it's very easy for kids to get into things relatively early, whether that be alcohol, drugs, or whatever the case might be. And it's funny because growing up in that community, I would always dress in black. I'd pretty much wear black Dickies and a black band shirt. And I probably had a chain on my wallet. And, people thought I was a bad influence. And, they would tell tales to my dad of how I was this bad influence in the community. And I was straight edge. I didn't drink. I didn't smoke. I didn't do drugs. But because I looked a certain way, people had certain opinions about me and, would just tell my dad that I was a bad influence. Meanwhile, their own kids, at 12, 13, 14, were already drinking very heavily, were already experimenting with drugs. So yeah, as soon as I turned 18, I was definitely ready to leave. And I can't say, while my dad still lives there and my sisters still live there, I can't say that I maintain a relationship to that place that I spent my formative years. So while I always have a difficulty with that question of like, well, where are you from? I think I'm more a person of where am I, like what helped develop me as a person. And I think all of those places along the way really helped develop who I am as a person.
Absolutely. I think we are the sum of all parts.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and it's I agree with you. It's kind of sad that that people judge you based on the way you express yourself. Right. I remember I grew up in Indonesia. I think there was a point, I forgot which year it was. I was still small, but people, or particularly government. Well, let me just say people in generalization, that the people with tattoos are criminals, right? And there was a point in which the government used that symbol to get rid of them.
Yeah.
Right. So for a period of time, the people were just in chaos. People tried to scrape the tattoo because, and I didn't think there was laser then. So I didn't know how they did it. Right. But, it was scary because you could be targeted by the government. Basically, target means you lose your life.
Yeah.
Right. People say, oh, this person has tattoo. So it must be affiliated with certain gangs, must be affiliated with some recidivism or whatever. Right. And at that point, the crime was high, and it's just an easy fix for the government, which is awful, right? So yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes people could be, quote unquote, weird by the normal, whatever, standard people, and then actually those guys are the good guys.
Well, I think for me too, it was also a really important experience, right? I walked through the world with a lot of privilege as a cisgendered straight white male. And during my youth to experience firsthand, biases based off of appearance and perception, and then people to affiliate their own narratives with those biases, right? Like it helped, I think, understand challenges that I don't experience in most everyday circumstances, again, as a person that walks through the world with a lot of privilege. So I also think it was an important experience to have during my developmental years.
Yeah, it's certainly making you a full person where you have a different perspective. Just like when I met some people here in Pittsburgh who have never been to New York City, for example. For me, it's like, so close, right? Does they live in a bubble which prohibits their perspective to expand? I think for me, if they could go abroad, probably it's better. I'm not just better, but it gives me even broader perspective of how different culture thinks about stuff, right?
Yeah, when I was in my 20s, I worked for an airline for about 7 years, and you've been everywhere. Yeah, I have a very nonlinear trajectory.
You are a full person. Let me say that.
I was very, very, very far below the threshold for poverty when I held that job. I was living on probably $16,000 a year, maybe, but that job allowed me to fly for free, and I took advantage of that to the fullest extent. And this is at a point in time where like Airbnbs and everything didn't exist. And I also didn't have money for hotels. So I always used this website, Couchsurfing, where you could just find people wherever that were willing to offer up their couch or their spare bedroom or whatever the case might be. So whenever I had more than a couple days off, I would go somewhere, wherever I could find a ticket and make a flight. I would go there and then I'd couch surf. And that was both domestically here in the US, but also internationally. And I felt like getting outside of my comfort zone, experiencing culture was really important to, again, developing who I am as a person. It's also what shaped my appreciation of public spaces and placemaking, because as I traveled to these destinations, I didn't have money to entertain myself. I set myself a very, very strict budget. So most of the time, what I could access was what was in the public realm, what was free and accessible. So, when a place has, a sculpture garden or a mural program or a great park system, or when their museums offer a free day, right? Those were the things that I tended to do with my time when I traveled. And so I think it also has shaped my perspective and values as a cultural worker to really appreciate placemaking and public art and really have a focus on accessibility.
Yeah, I was going to say that that's why I was writing that, because that experience that kind of force you to attend those free art, public art, that makes you valuable in this position, right? So we have here in Pittsburgh, we have a lot of public arts. We need more, but that you're coming from that experience that you want more people to appreciate arts freely. They don't have to pay some membership fee. They don't have to pay entrance or whatever. So we just
it's and it is challenging here because this is the first arts council I've worked for that we haven't had a role in public art, because there are other entities that are doing that. But when I was in Jacksonville, we administered on behalf of the city their public art collection. When I was in Erie, I did a very large amount of public art projects. So stepping into Pittsburgh and not having that be one of the roles of the Arts Council was a little bit of like letting go of ego a little bit and also letting go of passion, right? Those are the projects I love to facilitate. When I was in Erie, I curated quite a few large mural projects. And one of the things that I always focused on was not only how are you creating opportunities for the artists that live and work in your community, but also how are you bringing in guest artists from around the world? Because just like going into a museum where you expect to see a range of work by a range of artists, I felt it was really important within public space to also curate a range of options and to show work in Erie, Pennsylvania that might challenge expectations for what you'd find in Erie, Pennsylvania, by bringing in artists who are also painting in, Italy and Norway and Mexico and wherever else in the world, and seeing Erie, Pennsylvania as part of their portfolio now. But it was important to say, okay, how are we bringing museum experiences into the street and making it free and accessible?
Yeah. I remember, I don't know whether this is already during your tenure or not, but there's some section of the street that they want to create either mural or the public art. I forgot, is it in the Friendship or is it in the Bloomingfield?
There's a few projects,
right? I think at the corner or something, and then it's like, oh, let's build something here, right?
Yeah, so I think that's...
were you involved in that?
No, again, because as Arts Council, we're not really involved with that. I think that the kind of lead organization here in Pittsburgh that kind of takes the lead on those types of initiatives in collaboration with the city and their public art program would be ShiftWorks, which was formerly the Office of Public Art. And when they were the Office of Public Art, they were a fiscal sponsor of the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council, but their staff and our staff were separate staffs. But ShiftWorks does phenomenal work in our community and really helps artists have an entry point into public art careers and public art opportunities by helping with some of that technical assistance that can be a really, really heavy lift on some of those projects, and preparing them for submitting their portfolios for consideration and navigating kind of all of the red tape that goes with public art projects.
Yeah. So, okay. So going back to your personal journey. So which instrument do you play?
I actually don't play any instrument. So I've always found I'm better at supporting artists than being an artist myself. I definitely had moments when I was 15, 16.
So you're not in a band? I thought you were in a band.
No.
Oh, okay.
Just was in it as a supporter. So had moments where I would try to learn guitar and then would just find myself really frustrated because I wasn't picking it up. But I found that I could be a good promoter of the work. So, when I was 15 and 16, It was the early days of social media. Things like LiveJournal, Friendster, which then kind of grew into MySpace.
Exactly. I was going to say, what is that website?
Yeah, all of those things were kind of new and ways to help promote. But also, it was still a very analog point in time where you could get demo CDs and stickers, and bands would have street teams. And so I would always kind of play that role of like, how can I help get the word out? How can I help promote? How can I help hand out stickers or flyers or demos or whatever the case might be, versus like wanting to be in a band myself. And then when I moved down to West Palm Beach when I was 18, I started interning at a independent record label there that predominantly focused on hardcore bands, and got several bands from Erie, Pennsylvania and that region signed on to the label, and then helped them with kind of booking and promoting tours. So I've always found myself more in like that support role. And then when I was living up in Alaska, I didn't even know that careers in arts administration were like a possibility, but I had a lot of friends that were very, very talented musicians. So me and another friend started a video series where we were recording them in my cabin, 3 original songs to add not only their audio, but their visuals to it. That was called the Dry Cabin Sessions. And part of the reason we created that was so that we could support artists in their grant applications. So in Alaska, there's the Rasmussen Foundation, which provides grants to artists directly, but you need work samples. And a lot of my friends didn't have quality work samples. So one of the reasons we started the Dry Cabin Sessions was to provide them with those work samples, and then also assisted some of them with their grant applications, because again, it was a skill set that they might not have. So working through a budget, working through a narrative that was clear and concise and within the character limits. And then, learned that you could actually have a career doing that. So I'd say even since I was a teenager, I was a stronger art supporter than I was necessarily an arts maker. I will say I've always enjoyed writing. And for at least the last 10 years, I've always had a camera on me and really do enjoy lens-based storytelling.
So you mentioned that you went to college, right? So where? In Florida? Yeah,
so again, like, you're naive when you're 18. There's a whole world of things that you think you know, but you have no idea about. And
I still have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. And, I did not take academics seriously when I was in high school. And therefore, I wasn't really thinking about, like, what are my next steps for college? And very late in my senior year did I start to think about where did I want to go to school. And at that point in time, I thought I wanted to own an entertainment venue, right? Like, I spent so many years from 15 to 18, pretty much every weekend at a venue, and really thought that that's what I wanted to pursue. And I wanted to be an agent and book bands and book acts. And so that's the career journey I thought I wanted at that point in time. So it was late in my senior year, and I went to a college fair in Clarion and came across this school that had a sports and entertainment promotional management program. And it was in West Palm Beach, Florida. And I thought, okay, West Palm Beach, Florida, that sounds as different as possible from where I grew up. I don't know anything about this school. I don't know anything about this program, but I'm going to go for it, right? And I wish I would have maybe had some guidance to ask better questions, because it was a for-profit school that wasn't credited. I didn't qualify for federal student loans, so I had to take out all private student loans.
Wow.
And it was an expensive school. And it was also the president was Richard DeVos, who had been shut down by the federal government multiple times for pyramid schemes. So here I am going to this business school that's run by somebody who has been, engaged with the federal government for unethical businesses, but I didn't know any better, right? So I'm going to this school. I'm not finding myself challenged. I'm not really taking anything away from the program I'm in, but at the same time amassing an insane amount of student debt because it was all private loans, private school. After I got my associate's degree, I left there, stayed down in Florida for another year, and then eventually transferred up to Penn State Barrington, Erie, and just finished my degree in basic business because I didn't want to lose all of my credits that I had and the time that I dedicated. So finished with basic business. So I didn't necessarily pursue something that was passionate to me or something that I necessarily am even leveraging in my career right now. But you know, it was a good lesson in asking the right questions, making sure that you are informed in your decision making. And then I learned a whole heck of a lot in paying down student debt after I amassed so much.
Yeah. I think the breadth of your experiences, that made you, well, not made you, but, give you some, not energy, but it's like a knowledge bank.
Absolutely.
Right? Knowledge bank that allows you to be successful in what you're doing right now. And especially, again, your travel, knowing different perspective, the exposure of public arts, and then the struggle in obtaining like this formal education, and then your experiences living in many places with different cultures, even though you're coming from mid Pennsylvania, and it's making a whole person of yourself.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that when we navigate life, we either tend to learn something because of or in spite of.
Yeah.
And I try to figure out, like, has my life been more in spite of or because of? And I think that there's probably a pretty good balance there. But I certainly think that a lot of the things that are really important to who I am as a person was probably more in spite of than because of.
Yeah.
In spite of the circumstances that you're in. But yeah, I certainly recognize even from my early childhood, some of the challenges or adversities or kind of non-traditional situations, and recognize that, like, certainly there were moments where, like, it was daunting and emotionally heavy and all of these other things. I mean, being in your mid to late 20s and that anxiety of, like, oh my gosh, I'm $70,000 in debt and I'm living on $16,000 a year. Like, how do I make sense of that, right? And that anxiety and that sense of failure that comes with it. So there's certainly a heavy emotional toll that can come along the way. But I also think that the person I am today is very much, a culmination, as you mentioned, of like every step along the way.
Right. And I'm glad that the board of directors of GPAC were the one who hired you for this place, right, for this position. Yeah, I'm glad they did that. It's not that there are some. I know that some organizations, when they're looking for executive directors, when they're looking for the chief curator or whatever, anything art, looking for, the Ivy League MFA program graduates, people who are, snobs, right? But they're picking someone who actually, have been there, have gone this, the experiences, have been through the struggles. So which is important.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely extend my kudos to the board of directors that hired me. I do think that I have a pretty impressive portfolio of things that I've achieved in my 10 years working within this field. But from just a visual perspective or from an education perspective, not the typical person that is holding a CEO role. And to show up into an interview with hand tattoos and knuckle tattoos and stretched ears, and you know what I mean? Like, I recognize that is a very non-traditional appearance. And yes, it's becoming maybe more accepted as time progresses, but certainly do appreciate that the board saw something in me beyond just my physical appearance or my education. And thought that I was the right candidate for the position.
Yeah, I mean, I think for like any career, I guess the portfolio is important, right? So they know what you have done, right? I think they see tons of value in your portfolio as well, right? So So let's go back to GPAC.
Yes,
All right.
please.
So let me cut screen here. Right now, I'm showing this to my audience, and this is the Pittsburgh Art Council.org. This is the organization that you're leading right now, right?
Correct.
Okay. So, and for the past few months, I noticed tons of programs. For example, the Artsburg, right? And then, and I'm scrolling down here to Welcome to Artsburg, Creative Voices, Collective Power. So, what's the strategy here? So, is this? Do you still have some programs in mind that are going to be released, or if you can?
Yeah. So, after I joined, we started the strategic planning process, and we engaged Workhorse Collaborative and Shannon Paris Consulting in that process, and did a lot of listening. Did a lot of listening to our staff and board. Did a lot of listening to our stakeholders, and really tried to determine what does the Arts Council need to be, and where are the areas where maybe we've fallen short in the past. And what we learned through that process is that the community did not have high perceptions of our ability to administer both responsibly and long-term programs. We also learned, though, that that's not what they wanted from us. In the past, we had maybe tried to develop a program in response to a gap that existed within our ecosystem. And what the community shared was that there were either other people that were administering similar programs, and we were diverting attention and resources away from those programs, or those programs had a history of starting, being valued, but then disappearing and not having any context to why.
Which is a lot of those in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. And what folks really said they wanted us to be was those four things that I mentioned at the start of our conversation: an information hub, an amplifier, an advocate, and a convener. And what we learned through that process is that is not program driven, that's service driven. And so a lot of what we are doing is more one-on-one service and support than it is packaged programs. The other thing that we needed to do was really shift our perspective about what does it mean to deliver something to your stakeholders and to a ecosystem. And while in the past we thought about, events that you put on and you have an audience come and engage around, like that's a program, right? But realistically, for somebody like us, that one of our responsibilities is an information hub and to be an amplifier, it's actually communication strategies, right? And so investing really deeply and intentionally in our communication strategies and building out the capacity of our communications department to be more intentional in our newsletters, what information makes its way to our blog, how we're leveraging our social media. So there's a few things we've launched in the last 2 years, and it's not just because I've been in my role the last 2 years, but our team has changed pretty drastically in that time period. And having Lisa Cunningham come on as our director of marketing and communications, and leveraging her experience and expertise coming from media and working very directly with a lot of artists through her former roles in media, really thinking through what are the ways that the Arts Council should be utilizing its communication channels.
Yeah, I was going to say that we're having Lisa Cunningham. She's from City Paper, Pittsburgh, whom I had the privilege to work with also in the past. So yeah, it was a game changer for you guys.
So recognizing things like our monthly opportunities roundup, folks in our field want to know what the opportunities are for them, whether that be through employment or through calls to artists for artistic opportunities. So having something in our blog that we once a month scour the internet looking for opportunities to share with our community, the events roundups that we've been doing, which then evolved into Artsburg as well, right? Those are things that yes, they require a capacity, but in the grand scheme of things, they're a relatively light lift for major impact. We were in conversation with one of our stakeholders earlier this week that thanked us for all of the support we've provided through things like Artsburg and the events roundup, sharing that this year all of their events have been at capacity and that they believe that our contributions helped contribute to that, right? It's not the sole reason. Excellent programming is also a reason for that, but knowing that there's another avenue to reach a broader audience.
Yeah.
So really thinking through those communication channels as part of that service or quote unquote program that an arts council should be investing in. And it makes it challenging when having conversations with funders or corporate entities, because typically the applications and reports are always going to ask about number served, right? And they're typically thinking about it from an audience perspective,
Right.
which is going to be in tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands if you're thinking about like a multi-year ask. We don't have that, right? Like we are serving the few that go on to serve the many, right? We're
Right.
serving hundreds, but those hundreds then go on to serve tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands,
Right.
right? And really trying to convey to funders and supporters, like it's also really important to make sure that those hundreds are being served in those endeavors. The only thing that we really have that is quote unquote a program would be our Creative Hive, which is our monthly networking event for artists, culture bearers, folks that work within the field. And that is just really about building relationships and creating community. So every month we rotate to a different creative venue and we just bring people together with no agenda, but to build relationships.
It's wonderful.
And so
it's like a networking event.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have seen relationships build through that and collaborations formed through that and silos dismantled as a result of that. But beyond that, our work is really service oriented, thinking how are we, doing studio visits? How are we doing site visits? How are we learning what people aspire for, what obstacles they're up against, what opportunities they have to maybe take advantage of? And then thinking through how can we be a thought partner and maybe what the next steps are or the relationships that they might need to develop so we can help facilitate and be a bridge, or what resources could move them forward and how are we making them aware of it, but also preparing them to maybe pursue them or apply for them. So again, it's a lot different because one-on-one is a lot more labor intensive, right? Like it's time intensive, but I also think it leads to greater impacts and outcomes. And I think that that's also been a shift in the last 2 years, is really focusing on not just what are the outputs, but what is the impact and the outcome as a result of that labor.
Right. So, yeah, and you mentioned earlier, about the funders trying to get easy numbers, right? If you're providing a direct service, you're providing you're a art producing where people come in, they're like, say, okay, how many people, right? But with this service in which you relay the information of other artists, and they would ask about, what is the impact? And sometimes probably they will calculate, okay, if they provide money to you as opposed to provide money to probably some other entity which has already existed probably longer than you, like, oh, their distribution is 10 times bigger than you. Why should I give it to you? Right? You get the same money, probably I would just like, put in their calendar, on the events calendar, and they're gonna reach 100,000, whatever, right? So which is tough. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to really rely on quantitative, not just qualitative. I have been a broken record with my team about the importance of collecting testimonials, because the quantitative information helps make up for what could be perceived as lower numbers in the qualitative information, or vice versa.
Right. Yeah.
The qualitative information helps fill the gap for what could be perceived as lower numbers in the quantitative information. Right. So constantly telling my team, we have to be collecting testimonials. We have to be following through with, yes, we did this thing. We had this site visit. We had this studio visit. But what was achieved as a result of it? What was the outcome? What was the impact? How did we serve as a stepping stone for an artist's next opportunity or how do we help an organization navigate a difficult situation, right? Making sure we are collecting all of that. The other thing that I'm really trying to evolve here in Pittsburgh is how funders perceive us. I'm not interested in being a grantee of a foundation, though recognizing right now that needs to be the role. I want to be a partner and a service provider of these foundations, of corporate entities that are making an investment into the field. Because if they leverage us as a partner, we can provide wraparound services that both help shield and uplift their greater investment, right? If you're an entity that is making a substantial investment year over year in a field, then you should also have an investment in the intermediary that is really serving as that lead storyteller, the lead advocate, the lead information hub of that sector. Because one, again, we're helping shield the investment, especially through that advocacy work that we're doing. Two, we're helping uplift the investment. But three, the presence of us and us being that information hub also helps provide a little bit of a barrier that would otherwise go directly to philanthropy if it wasn't for us, right? If we didn't exist to be that information hub, everybody that has a question is probably going to turn to philanthropy to receive an answer. So us being present also helps kind of serve as that filter to help maybe alleviate some of the pressure and requests that otherwise program officers would likely be receiving.
But by doing that, it could be like a double-edged sword, right? Because the artist may see you, oh, you're not my partner. You are the funder's partner. You know what I'm saying? Like you're not on my side, you're on their side. So right?
I think we balance that by being in the weeds with folks.
Right. So I appreciate, and I really, when I start seeing, I think your social media, when you visit artists or workspace, it's like, great, there's more, please, right? Because we have tons of artists over here, and then by doing that, you are making them your partner. Like, hey, I'm with you, right? I'm promoting your stuff. What you're doing is a great artwork, and let's work on this together.
Yeah, I think that our entire staff has a relationship to the field that we serve, and that's super, super critical. If we didn't, I think it would be very easy for us to be perceived as outsiders. But our staff shows up, right? And a lot of our staff also have their own personal practices, right? And I think that helps us be an insider, not an outsider. But being in the weeds with people, doing site visits, doing studio visits, attending events, right? Helping tell those stories, I think helps offset what otherwise could be a double-edged sword.
Right. So, yeah. So that's great. Yeah, I love seeing that. And I think that's one of the reasons why, hey, I need to talk to this guy. What do you have in mind? So looking at your site, let me cut through that again. And I'm looking at this document, learnings and recommendations. I am giving you kudos right now for having this. Because so many times when whoever in Pittsburgh, right, they have all these activities, they have all these projects, whether successful or not, especially when they're not successful, they don't care about, or probably they care, probably they knew what their learnings, but they do not distribute it. They do not share that knowledge, saying, oh, yeah, okay, we do this and we fail. We do this and we are successful. So knowledge is key, especially not especially for everybody, right? Even for, I'm pretty sure in UPMC, when there's a surgery, when it fails, they must have a powwow, like what happened? What went wrong, right? Probably, they don't want to put that on newspaper, right? But then for us as a public, as a public entity, and we have less money to do all these experiments, to do this probably theoretical exercise to figure out what went wrong. this exercise, these learnings and recommendation, as well as the followed by the recommendations, are excellent.
Well, thank you. I mean, I have to again uplift Workhorse Collaborative and Shannon Paris Consulting. They are who led us through this process.
And the fact that you publish them, right? Probably a lot of organizations do that, right? They hire someone, or they either they do it themselves, and then they just power by themselves, and then okay, never leave this room.
Well, I think, there's a few benefits that aligned with the time in which we did our strategic plan and published this report.
Mm-hmm.
The first is that I was new and a good amount of our staff was new. So we didn't have a sense of defensiveness around the history of our organization, right? And so we could hear the constructive criticism and not be defensive to it. And we could be open to what we were truly hearing from our stakeholders. The second thing is the community was already saying things about us, whether it was the funding community, the community of folks that rely on our services and support. They already had their opinions and perceptions of us. And if those things were being said about us around us, we also needed to be willing to accept them as truths about ourselves and own them. And I think that sometimes there is a hesitation to own the blemishes, when in reality, I think that it is a critical exercise of accountability. There's this fear that if you own your blemishes, you're less fundable.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have found in my first 2 years here at the Arts Council is if we're willing to own our blemishes, our funders are actually more willing to have important conversations with us because of that degree of accountability, that degree of transparency, that degree of proactive communication. I think that it's really important for us to, if these things are being said about us, to acknowledge them and own them. I definitely recognized and was sensitive to, there are things in this report that could potentially feel very prickly and uncomfortable for past staff members, past board members, right? Like there's some hard truths in that report. And, I don't want anybody to ever feel like we're throwing them under the bus, or that we are saying that they did a bad job or that they're bad individuals. That's certainly not the case. But we did need to recognize like when the organization maybe had some missteps that actually led to harm within our community. Harm because it either broke trust or put people in a vulnerable situation or didn't meet or fulfill expectations that were communicated, right? Like we needed to be willing to own that.
Yeah. So when I read that statement, like you inflict harm, it's like, wow, that's such a strong words. And then, again, kudos to you guys to actually say that, right? I remember, again, during COVID and of course, during the unrest because of the George Floyd murder several years ago, right? There are so many people who are like not sure what to do, right? But only few organizations admitted, the past harms that their organizations or their companies or whatever did in the past, right? Even as a country, right? Yeah, of course, right? Like hundreds of years ago, the country did harm, right? But to acknowledge that, I think people, like you said, people were more open when you acknowledge it. Yeah, people are talking about it. Why don't you just say it now, right? Just put it in writing that, validate that, you're right. You're not just dreaming or like gaslighting me, but it's true.
It also creates the opportunity for repair, right?
Absolutely.
If we don't acknowledge the harm, then we stand no chance of repair. And if we're willing to acknowledge that, then we can also start to have conversations about what does it mean to rebuild trust? What does restoration look like? What would we need to do for repair? And I think that that's also why it's really, really important to acknowledge it.
Right. So I know the saying that you cannot improve what you do not measure, right? So do you have metrics for your GPAC that you measure?
Yeah, we do. So there's a very large implementation plan that goes along with the strategic plan, and there are metrics associated with that. We also started our biannual impact reports. Our next one will be released in September. There's metrics we're measuring in that. And then internally as an organization, we are adopting role charters to be complementary to job descriptions, but within that also has metrics for every position on our team that it will be measuring.
What about probably you? Like you already mentioned the document. I think I saw that. I just do not have it on screen here. But do you have any metrics that you can share here that holds you accountable to the things that you give to the public?
Yeah, so like the biannual impact report is one of those. So one of them was really repositioning ourselves as a credible source and one that's transparent. So making sure that we are continuing that stride of releasing 2 reports a year that show exactly what our financials are, how they were used, and what the impact of that funding is. Additionally, we're publishing our meeting minutes to our website and our organizational finances monthly to our website. So a lot of it is the transparency in those measures
the
as
processes,
well. Yeah.
What about the actual deliverables that you give, that you provide to the artists?
Can you be more specific?
Let's say if you provide service to, for example, I see that your site visits, they're like a great service, right? Probably you have target like, okay, I'm going to do 100 site visits this year.
So it's not as defined that way. I probably do hit about 100 or more a year. Those site visits, every single one of them does include a deliverable afterwards, though. So I do curious question asking when I'm in those site visits, and I actively listen. And then after every one, I follow up with a curated email that is specific to the conversation we had, whether it's opportunities the person should be aware of, resources I feel they should tap into, connections that they should have that we can also help facilitate, and a commitment to then send that follow-up. You know, there is a deliverable that comes with every single one of those, but we haven't set a target or a metric for the number per year that we'll do. We are getting ready to roll out our membership, and I think there are some targeted metrics and deliverables associated with those. But those site visits are also why it's really important to really make sure we're collecting the qualitative information as well, because that also helps us know over time, how does this impact someone's journey, right? How does this meeting we had today and then the introduction we facilitated, how does that maybe pay off a couple months from now or a couple years from now? And so for us, one of the focuses we have right now is really relationship building. I think in the past, especially when you administer grants, your relationships are very transactional. I have a relationship with you as long as I get X from you. And for us, we're really trying to make those relationships long-term so that we can have these relationships with folks and see like, okay, year 1 to year 2, what was the progress? Year 2 to year 3, what was the progress? And I think that what is the important metric that we're talking about a little bit is how are we sustaining relationships, right? The folks that we do site visits and studio visits with today, do we maintain a relationship with them still a year from now?
Right.
Do they feel like they can still come to us as a resource a year from now? What about 2 years from now? Right? Because as we build our base of folks that look to us for support, we also need to make sure our commitment and service to the folks that were first in the door doesn't dwindle, right? So I think that those are more of the long-term metrics that you're talking about, but they can only be measured over time.
Right. And you mentioned about a year from now or 2 periodically, in the future. I think that happens when they see value in your first visit. Like, right? If I think GPAC's organization, who knows more artists, you could be the enabler, you could be the connector. Like you mentioned, you're doing probably would be complementary to the artist that you. So you make that connections, right? That will allow collaborations that probably should have happened organically, but they don't, right? But with you be the connector, you be the hub, right? You be the collaborative hub for connecting people. I think when people, I think for artists sometimes we are, I'm using we because I take pictures too, and I think that I do make some art too. That when we are so in it, we have no time to go elsewhere or to find a network, because like I like what I'm doing, I'm not done.
Yes.
And we are so perfectionist, and we don't escape, we don't get out of from our cocoon, right? So, and but having this site visit and you provide the information, I think it would be really helpful.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I think that it's also just really important for us to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse, right? We need to be able to know what are the roadblocks people are experiencing, what are the opportunities they're most excited about, what are the resources they wish they had access to. All of that is super critical to informing both the service that we provide, but also the advocacy that we lead.
Right. So I'm just curious because I was a member of a photography association for journalists, NPPA, several years ago, and members were always like talking about, can you guys provide insurance? Because it's so hard, right? I mean, because if you're a part of group, you're part of membership, and probably you can negotiate a better rate. So it is.
So the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania makes that incredibly, incredibly difficult. It is not a local issue, it's a state issue.
Oh, wow.
And so when we were going through our strategic planning process, we looked at, should the Arts Council, as a backbone entity, provide shared services that could help either improve efficiencies or drive down expenses for our stakeholders. And there were a few things that we learned folks wanted that they didn't have access to. One, they felt they were underinsured or not insured. Or two, they felt like they didn't have access to financial planning to help build a financial safety net.
Right.
So we looked at, okay, health insurance and financial retirement planning. Are those things that we can deliver responsibly at a lower cost than if people just go into the marketplace themselves? I'll start with financial planning because that was the easiest one. At the time that we were doing the due diligence, we had a 403B that we were administering. And what we found was that we couldn't change that 403B until it had $1 million in assets in it.
Wow.
Which, as a small employer, it's going to take a long time before it reaches $1 million in assets. So there was no way to change that plan. So what we had to start to look at were IRAs, right? And either simple IRAs or Roth IRAs. And we worked with some local brokers that were really receptive to what we were trying to accomplish. And what we found was, truthfully, there was nothing that we could administer as a group that provided cost savings that folks couldn't just achieve on their own through a Fidelity product, a Vanguard product, especially with things like ETAs available now, right? Like, there just wasn't an economic advantage to somebody saying, okay, let's join the Arts Council's simple IRA versus just doing something that we 100% control.
Right.
So it wasn't plausible. But what we should be doing is, instead of saying, okay, we have something that we can do as a shared service, when the question arises or when the topic arises, let people know what their options are, right? Let folks know that things like a Vanguard account or a Fidelity account is a lot more accessible than what they might imagine. And, maybe the challenges or risks of chasing stocks versus looking at like an ETA or a mutual fund, or how they can access actually free or reduced price financial planning, right? Being the one that connects them to the resources versus being the administrator of the resource. What we found with health insurance was very interesting because we didn't have good organizational records, right? The Arts Council didn't necessarily have a good record of like, well, what are all the things that we imagined at some point in time and explored and ultimately chose not to do something with. And when we reached out to our broker to start talking about some type of group plan, what he shared with us was, did you know this is the third time you've explored this as an organization? And it was new information to us. We hadn't realized that we had already explored it 2 other times previously, and that each time we learned it wasn't plausible. And the reason it's not plausible is, in order to administer a group plan, you need to first be an entity that comes together for a purpose and a reason other than the administration of a group plan. And that either needs to be mission driven or place driven. So an example of that is actually the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust. The trust could qualify for a group plan because its resident organizations come together with them for a mission place-based purpose, right? So if it was the CLO or the Symphony or the Pittsburgh Public Theater or any other entity that utilizes the ballet, they could actually work with an entity like the trust on a group plan because they've already come together for a purpose other than the administration of a group plan. We did not have that place-driven kind of amalgamation, let's say. The other thing we found is that even if you are successful in meeting the criteria for a group plan, which is challenging, the second heavy lift is finding somebody that's willing to underwrite it.
Right.
So even if you can meet the criteria, finding someone that's willing to underwrite it and underwrite it at a reasonable rate is also a very, very heavy lift. And we ultimately found that the barriers at the current moment, because of state regulations, were too heavy of a lift. That being said, and again, under the current federal administration, there's a lot that remains very ambiguous as it relates to healthcare and who has access to it. But at the time that we went through this planning, what we found is those that are underinsured and are concerned about insurance and want to know what their options are, Penny is a great state level website that we should be directing people to. And then really thinking about, if they have questions about it, how do we direct them to technical assistance to navigate that website? So what we found was, instead of being someone, again, that tries to fill the gap by providing the insurance, our responsibility is to be the information hub and say, okay, you're interested in insurance. Here is an open marketplace through the state that provides affordable options. If you need assistance with navigating it, here's what your options are for technical assistance, right? Serving in that information hub role versus the administrator role.
Okay, I see. All right. So you mentioned about the there's a state law, there's a federal law, right? Regarding regulating about the insurance and other stuff. So that makes me curious. Let's jump a little bit, but still in the federal level thing. So considering what's happening to Smithsonian, Kennedy Center, PBS, corporate or public broadcasting. So is it impacting you guys, or are you foreseeing that it's going to impact you in the future?
So I think there's a few things we need to acknowledge first and foremost. We are seeing 2 things happen simultaneously that are very, very concerning. One is an unprecedented federal disinvestment in the arts. That's coming by way of impacts on the NEA and the NEH through their funding. But the truth is, there's no organizations in our arts ecosystem or any larger arts ecosystem that I'm aware of that is sustaining its operations as a result of NEA or NEH grants, right? Those are always project-driven grants that are competitive, that also do have a heavy administrative lift on them. And in many situations, an NEA grant or an NEH grant is probably tens of thousands of dollars, right? It's not necessarily, for most organizations, a 6-figure grant. In the past, when we've received NEA grants, they're $10,000, $15,000, and they also require a 1-to-1 match of private dollars, right? And there is a lot of heavy lift that goes into the application and into the reporting. So while it's important to see public support for the arts, I don't think any arts organization is keeping its doors open as a result of an NEA grant. The grants that I think were more substantial, that are more concerning to see rolled back, are the IMLS grants,
which is
the Institute of Museum and Library Services. There are a lot of organizations in our community that have received six-figure grants from IMLS to do curatorial work, to do research work, to mount new exhibitions. And there were grants that were awarded that institutions thought they had when programming this fiscal year that they then learned they don't have. But a lot of our institutions, the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Children's Museum, they have all received very meaningful IMLS grants. And so it's easy to talk about the NEA and the NEH because I think more people are familiar with those federal agencies. But the grants that are really, I think, larger and more impactful to lose, especially on a short-term notice, are those IMLS grants. I'll also say, though, that in itself is a double-edged sword because it's typically the large institutions that are qualifying for and receiving those IMLS grants, right? It's not the small and mid-sized groups. In addition to that, the other tremendously impactful impact on funding is through the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, right? Seeing that loss and what that means for local media partners of them, whether it be the PBS affiliate or the NPR affiliate, that is a devastating loss. And it's also, I think, a very calculated attack on independent journalism and news. So we talked about the one prong, which is the federal disinvestment. The second prong, which is equally concerning, is the federal intervention, right? Seeing the takeover of boards of federally funded institutions like the Smithsonian or the Kennedy Center, seeing folks removed from their position and replaced with folks that have more nationalistic ideology is very, very concerning. Seeing the criteria to qualify for NEA grants or NEH grants become more rooted in perpetuating nationalistic ideology. So taking the arts and now turning it into propaganda is incredibly concerning. So those two things happening simultaneously are very, very concerning, very unprecedented for our sector, and something that everybody, regardless of whether they have a personal relationship with the arts and humanities, should be concerned about for what it means for democracy as we understand it and as a defense against authoritarian regimes. Those two things are happening simultaneously, and it is very alarming. And as an advocacy organization, we are certainly taking an active role in making sure that we are vocal about why we stand against those things. There are large coalitions right now that are happening about defending artistic liberties, fighting against censorship, right? Fighting against kind of values and moral stances against artwork. And we are actively involved in those conversations and in those efforts. And I think the other thing we have to make sure that we are protecting against is that we don't see a trickle-down effect, that we don't see what's happening at the federal level become something that is happening at the state level, right? We've already, we've seen the impacts and the effects of DOGE at the federal level, and we've had folks like Mastriano call for DOGE at the state level, and we really need to take an active stance against that happening at the state level. Even in the last year, we've seen other states roll back their protections or their funding for things in the arts and humanities. I believe Florida was probably one of the first states to completely cut all of their state level funding for the arts. As somebody that previously worked there, that was really devastating to see. But we want to make sure that that's not happening at the state level here. The other thing, too, that in this context I think is really important to acknowledge is that by and large, public investment in the arts has been outpaced by all of our foreign counterparts that are, quote unquote, developed economies and countries, right? I think it's if you add the per capita investment of the both NEA and the NEH, it's only like $1.29 per person per capita. That is wildly less than, you know, our European counterparts. And it also really undervalues the role of art and humanities as part of a democratic society.
Yeah.
And if we look at the state level, you know, Pennsylvania for the last several years has been the 33rd least funded state publicly per capita for the arts, while we consistently remain one of the top 15 for arts vibrancy. That is a huge disconnect, right? We've been flat at a budget level for state funding for the arts for 16 grant cycles now. The only state around us that we are ahead of is West Virginia. Ohio, I think, is at least double what our investment in the arts is. New Jersey is even more than that. New York is substantially more than that. But we are being out invested in by our surrounding peers. And the same thing goes for a lot of the tax incentives like film, right? Pennsylvania was one of the first states to have a tax incentive for film. And that's why you started to see so many films produced here. But over time, as more states adopted them and ours became less competitive, you started to see less and less productions here. And now you're seeing them in Atlanta, and you previously saw them in Alaska. New Orleans is another location you're seeing more of, right? We really have to think about our investment in the arts as a defense against an attack on democracy, but also as a strategy for economic development. I don't think that we should measure the arts and their value by economic terms, but I do think we should recognize that investments in the arts are an economic strategy, especially because as you look at younger, diverse workforces, where they want to live and work are places they have high access to arts, entertainment, and recreation. Those three things are incredibly important. So as a state and as a community, we really need to be thinking about what are our investments and proactive strategies in those areas.
So you mentioned about the funding per capita from the public funding perspective. Do you think it's because of the amount of money given by the old money, you know, by the Heinz, by the Rockefeller, by those guys?
Yes and no. I think locally that is a challenge, right? Our philanthropy is a double-edged sword for Pittsburgh in particular. We have probably one of the highest rates per capita of philanthropic investment in the arts, certainly. And that is a result of being a Gilded Age community, right?
Right.
And I think that Pittsburgh is a really interesting case study because so much of people's engagement with the arts in Pittsburgh happens through nonprofit activity. It is nonprofit organizations that are creating the opportunities for engagement. And a lot of that historically has been very much supported through strong philanthropic activity. And I do think that that is also why we see a lower rate of corporate support and individual support in comparison to other communities, as well as public support, right? The city of Pittsburgh does not provide public funding for the arts. When I was living in Jacksonville, Florida, which at the time was a red city in the red state, they were providing almost $3 million a year in grant making to the arts. So we as the Arts Council received that money from the city and then administered it as grants to arts organizations in the city. That's a red city in a red state investing almost $3 million annually, right? It's even increased since then. Pittsburgh has no funding for the arts right now. And I think part of that is because you have an entity like our philanthropic engine here. But in addition to that, when something like RAD becomes established, it goes, okay, well, that's the public mechanism for investment. And I think RAD is a phenomenal asset to have for the nonprofit community. But I also think that it's not a dedicated revenue stream for the arts, right? It is a competitive process that also funds parks and other things. And it's wonderful. But a lot of cities actually have line items in their budgets, and a lot of counties have line items in their budget for the arts. You can look to Ohio as an example. Cuyahoga County, massive investments in the arts because their tax percentage goes directly to their arts council versus a non-arts entity. So there are a lot of, I think, complex mechanisms that are present in Pittsburgh. The other thing is because so much of our arts experiences are driven by arts nonprofits, and thank goodness we have them, we don't see the type of arts entrepreneurship the way we might in other communities, because we also don't have the capital to support it. Because we're thinking about, if we want to access capital, we have to do it through nonprofit activity. So therefore, I either need to find a fiscal sponsor or I need to become a nonprofit myself if I want to access capital. But if you look in other communities where you have nonprofit entities, or I'm sorry, for-profit entities that are investing in work and pushing boundaries and innovating and driving an arts ecosystem to be complementary to its nonprofit activity as well, we don't really have that here in Pittsburgh. So, when you think about things like Meow Wolf, which is now, started in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and is now in Denver and Las Vegas and New York, right? The way that supports an arts ecosystem and creates paid opportunities for arts workers and artists themselves, right? Or some of the mural festivals, or heck, even the projection exhibitions that occurred with Van Gogh. That wasn't nonprofit activity, that was for-profit activity. And I understand why folks might cringe around capitalism. And I, as growing up in the punk rock hardcore community, feel similarly at times. But also it does drive innovation, and it brings capital into an ecosystem in a way that nonprofit activity doesn't.
Yeah, because it's challenging, as artists, when you fight for grants, when you fight for whatever projects, and then the monetary reward can't really actually say reward. It's not even enough to cover costs, right? And most artists here, I must say that, they must have other jobs, or artists is just like a side job, right? Something they do after they're done with their day job, which is challenging, right? That do you see, or is there a vision of how to change it, or is it just going to be starving artist mentality?
Yeah, so one is we are a firm advocate. We have a lot of folks that reach out to us because they have a project they want to do, and then they have no budget to fund artists, right? And one of the things that we always take a hard stance on, we will not promote any project that doesn't have an equitable compensation for artists. We do not believe in promoting things because it's an opportunity for exposure, right? We will not encourage an artist to take on a job because it will provide them with quote unquote exposure, right? We take a hard stance on that. With our opportunities roundup, we are very steadfast that in order for an opportunity to be included in there, it has to be transparent about what the compensation is. In addition to that, we're working right now to define a list of priorities that we're sharing with our elected officials that are, the priorities for our sector. And one of them that we are positioned to take to the city and talk with them about is that any opportunity that the city has to hire an artist or a creative person should meet or exceed wage standards. So there is a national organization called WAGE, W-A-G-E. It stands for Working Artists in the Greater Economy. And they set forth equity standards to say, here's the baseline for what equitable compensation is for these opportunities. And we really want to see more of our community adopting those wage standards so that our folks in our field start to be valued appropriately, and that they can have upward mobility in their work here, and not rely on kind of philanthropic activity in order to be able to support themselves. In addition to that, we are also very serious about how are we connecting folks to opportunities outside of Pittsburgh, right? There are many artists that are living and working here in Pittsburgh that are creating work that should be reaching audiences outside of Pittsburgh. And they need to be positioned in a way that allows them to know those opportunities exist and tap into those opportunities. So a lot of my site visits and studio visits that I do, it's also making them aware of, yes, maintain your practice here, live and work here, have this studio, but know what opportunities exist outside of Pittsburgh as well. Know where to find calls for artists. Know what your opportunities for exhibition or performance are. Make sure you are tapped into these national systems so that you're not solely reliant on the local ecosystem to sustain yourself. And I think there are artists in our community that are doing a great example of that. Michaela Wana is a phenomenal example of somebody who's, homegrown here in Pittsburgh, but has started to take his work outside of Pittsburgh from very meaningful opportunities. There are other folks as well, like Atticus Adams is another great example. The challenge is we need to make sure that Pittsburgh supports their entire personhood so that once they reach that success, they don't leave Pittsburgh, right? We have many people in our theater world, in our dance world, in our visual arts world who, started to become a rising star. Literary arts, I forgot to mention our writers, right? We have many people that have started to become rising stars in their specific discipline while living and working here in Pittsburgh, but perhaps their entire personhood wasn't supported here, so they left Pittsburgh and they found themselves in places where their personhood was better supported.
Yeah, I think that applies to everybody, right? The engineers, we see that a lot of I forgot the name, but several weeks ago, tech company, they reach a unicorn level and boom, they move to San Francisco, right? So, which is sad, right? But sometimes, that's what they have to do to go to the next level, right? Again, like you said, how do you support the wholesomeness as a person, as personhood, or as an institution, as an entity? How can they be a bigger one, but remains in Pittsburgh?
And for a lot of the folks we've lost, a lot of the incredible talent in the literary arts, in dance, in theater, in visual arts, there have been certain traits and characteristics that have been shared by some of those folks that have left and looked for areas that embraced them better. They were either Black and brown, or they were female, or they were queer identifying, right? Recognizing the disparities and challenges that still exist here in Pittsburgh for individuals that navigate this world with real and measurable challenges as a result of disparities and inequities and injustices, and being intentional about resolving those things, right? Not resolving those things is a policy choice. They are solvable issues. If we see health disparities that are applicable to a specific race and a specific gender, that is a policy choice to continue to see that perpetuate year over year.
Then going back to what I said earlier, you can't improve what you don't measure. And then what you measure, you have to publish it.
Absolutely.
And you publish it every year and see the numbers dwindle down. That's a good progress, right? Yeah, I think I mentioned this many years ago, probably, or a couple of years back. Yeah, there was a report where there was still a mayor for those a government. Yeah, they come up with how. Let me just say how racist Pittsburgh is, right? They come up with a report, but then what happens?
And we ourselves are guilty of that, right? We just it was right when I started. We were already out of the gate with it, but we released our second report on racial inequities in the arts, right? And found for the second time in, I think, a 5-year study, the second iteration 5 years later, that it's still racially inequitable.
Yeah.
And I think that where some of our stakeholders' frustrations came was we don't need another report. We know this. We live this.
Yes.
What we need is somebody that's going to drive the needle of change. And if you're not willing to drive the needle of change, then what right do you have to also lead the report? Right. And so that's a hard truth to sit with, right? If we are going to do a research project, if we are going to release a report, then we also have a responsibility to the findings to drive change. And if we don't have the capacity, if we don't have the resources, or even worse, if we don't have the interest in driving change, then it's probably not responsible of us to do the report, because we're just sharing what folks already know.
Yeah, or at least the report, and then when you have your stakeholders, and the stakeholders has a responsibility to produce programs that can be measured, that will be measured how they progress, right? Whether they're actually trying to tackle the problems, right? Sometimes, like I do have this report, I put it on my cabinet. Sorry, I cannot show it to you. It's the Inclusion Index Pittsburgh scores. I put it there, so I'm always reminded of that. That our scores are still low. They continue producing reports, and it's still low. Several years ago, it's still as low. But what are the programs coming out of that report?
Right. So if something stays stagnant, it is a policy choice.
It's a policy
and
choice.
we have to acknowledge that. It's not happening by circumstance.
Yep.
It is happening by choice, because our choice is to be passive about it.
Yeah. And hopefully something happens, hopefully whatever, right? When the wind blows, right? So, okay, last question. So what have you heard from the Pittsburgh artists during your site visits or otherwise about their new challenges in living as artists since January 21st, since the election?
I mean, there's certainly concerns about erasure, censorship, attacks on specific identities. Being an artist already in and of itself is an act of vulnerability, because many artists are making work that is very personal to them and shaped by their lived experiences and their perspectives and their values. Mm-hmm. And when you share that out with the world, it is a vulnerable act. And so artists are already starting from a position of vulnerability. But when you also add into that the additional layers of folks that are Black and brown or queer or disabled or coming to the US from somewhere else and maybe English is a second language, right? These are all additional elements of vulnerability that comes from the exposure. And there is certainly a really, really large concern around what it means to be a vulnerable artist under the present federal administration. In addition to that, there are many folks that work within our field who live and navigate the world with disabilities and who are maybe coming from vulnerable populations or are living below the economic threshold of poverty. And there is huge concerns around what the Big Beautiful Bill Act means for them to be able to not just survive, but have chances of thriving in this current America. It's definitely a concern. I think also as Pittsburgh ramps up its efforts for development, whether that be in places like East Liberty or elsewhere, what displacement means, right? We have still not, as a community, acknowledged our collective harm that we have done in the name of progress, right? You think about the acts that were taken against communities like the Hill District in the name of progress that completely culturally uprooted an entire community of people, right? And a cultural identity of people. We haven't repaired that harm. And what's worse is we're often replicating it in other communities like East Liberty, right? That is why institutions like the Kelly Strayhorn Theater are so incredibly important, right? KST has programming coming up this season that's looking at queer identity in East Liberty because of nightclubs that existed in East Liberty, right? They're talking about the changing identity of the community as development happens, but it's also leading to themselves being displaced in 2029 because of their building being for sale.
Wow.
Right? So we have to acknowledge and address the displacement that's happening, and that is a real concern for artists and arts organizations because, you can look at a place like Lawrenceville, which is where I also live, and recognize the stories that existed 10 and 15 and 20 years ago about how nobody wanted to live there, but artists flocked there because it was affordable and artists made it interesting. And now it's at a place where artists can't even afford to be a homeowner there, right? So this idea of do I belong, where I belong, how can I afford to belong, and belong in the neighborhoods where I want to be, right? I don't want to be pushed to the outskirts where, yes, it's maybe more affordable, but it's also removing me further and further from the economic heart and the cultural activity that I contribute to, right? So I think that in addition to all of the federal concerns that we certainly have local concerns. And, as the city rushes to prepare for the draft, also recognizing the disruption that's happening for many folks that live here. I mean, we can take a look at Penn Avenue and recognize the Penn Avenue Arts and Business District as something that's really special in Pittsburgh, in the Bloomfield-Garfield neighborhoods. But I have heard from so many about how disruptive the constant progressive construction has been along Penn Avenue, and the fact that it's seemingly unending. And what does that mean for places like Assemble and the Glass Center and Silver Eye and Boom Concepts, but also those for-profit entities like, Workshop and Bantha Tea Bar and People's Indian Buffet, right? Like, all of these places are being impacted by what is happening in the name of progress, what is happening in the name of growth. And so we really have to have conversations about how can we be a forward-thinking community, but not at the expense to ourselves.